Frameworks, humanity's upgrade in the story of stories. Narrative software patches and the iterative learning of Totem. By Brooks Crenshaw, November 27, 2024. Note, this article is part of a series that explores the useful concept of frameworks and their applications. Throughout the series, we'll examine how these frameworks influence our understanding of reality, our roles within it, and how they guide our actions and decisions. In previous articles, we examined the concept of frameworks, highlighting story as a uniquely superior framework, with the biblical corpus standing as an unparalleled collection of such stories. Story is humanity's primary framework for encoding and transmitting how to be. It overrides biological impulses, instantiates values, and aligns humanity with objective reality, making scientific inquiry and human flourishing possible. We also examined recurring themes that transcend cultures and weave through the biblical narrative itself. Throughout, I have sought to approach this grand narrative with a dispassionate lens, steering clear of spiraling tribal or denominational mires. These, in my experience, not only cloud genuine exploration but also construct unnecessary and rigid secondary orthodoxies, bound by tribal allegiance rather than pursuit of truth. In our previous explorations, I've invited you to temporarily set aside personal beliefs or disbeliefs in the literal to examine the biblical narrative at this level of analysis. Along the way, I introduced mechanisms designed to keep the exploration grounded and stable. Among these, the following are particularly key to this article. Parable: timeless truth is greater than the singular historical event. The value of parables lies in their universal truths, which transcend their historical literalism. These archetypal stories serve as recurring patterns in human development, offering meaning and guidance beyond the narrower question of whether they describe a one-time historical event. This is not to discount the literal, but to argue that the hierarchy of values prioritizes the recurring and profound truths they encode, higher-order truths that express the enduring dynamics of human existence. God is greater than or equal to reality. The concept of God must be equal to or greater than reality, as God as described does not exist as a mere subset of it. This framework highlights reality itself as the ultimate authority, rewarding alignment with it and punishing deviation from it, embodying the profound I am that transcends all other wills in the universe. The magic stays in the book. The biblical narrative transforms literal events into metaphoric truths, emphasizing internal transformation over external proof. Like the use of physical totems in early learning, these stories teach profound lessons through metaphor, transcending their literal interpretations. Before we begin, humanity is a ceaseless chain of experiments, a perpetual striving that defines our essence, shaping who we are through continual improvement, conflict, collaboration, adaptation, curiosity, and the pursuit of meaning. What has worked in this tapestry of experimentation informs these inherited stories at the deepest of levels. So much so, I am uncertain how to classify them, or to what to attribute their origins, though it is plausible they emerged through iterative processes, much like our own biological and cultural development across millennia. But cultural evolution operates on a shorter timescale, allowing for more rapid adaptation and refinement, making it the most plausible framework for examining the text's profound effects on humanity's trajectory. These stories have not only shaped individual behaviors, but also established the frameworks through which societies flourish and align with reality. Between nature and truth. As described in the biblical narrative, the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 14. Having already tied together the notion that the Spirit of God is equivalent to objective truth, the meaning emerges that suggests basest instincts and higher-order truth exist in tension, if not outright opposition. This implies that to exist in nature is one layer of truth, but to ascend toward greater understanding, that nature must be tamed. This notion, along with references to brute beasts and men governed solely by their senses, aptly describes not only preconscious early man but also the contemporaries of the biblical text whose lives were ruled by hedonic and hypothalamic drives. What's more, these descriptions remain just as reasonably accurate when applied to modern contemporaries who embody these same impulses, those who spurn objective truth for the fleeting comforts of immediacy. From early man to the conception of these ancient stories, humanity has faced resource scarcity, group survival pressures, and social hierarchies that often incentivized, perhaps perversely, the elimination of the weak. Over time, however, the very definition of weakness has evolved, fracturing across multiple levels of analysis. Is this person strong in physical dominance, but weak in fostering trust? Adaptable in resourcefulness, but lacking long-term strategy? Resilient under stress, but prone to destructive impulsivity? These considerations became as vital to survival as raw strength, clever cognition, and resilient immunity. Yet, these more primitive drives are still encoded in our biology, running quietly in the background, waiting to surface should a society grow too decadent in abundance, or too misaligned with reality, which is to say, too far from God. What's more, these background impulses are hackable, susceptible to manipulation that redirects them toward destructive ends, whether by social media conglomerate, or federal agency. When alignment with reality falters at scale, whether by neglect or exploitation, judgment is swift and brutal. Reality, as the ultimate arbiter, will not be denied. A function beyond origin and certainty. The primary function of the biblical narrative is often misapprehended. Both proponents and antagonists alike frequently reduce it to a simplistic explanation for humanity's origins, or a rationalization for the afterlife. These interpretations, while common, fail to grasp the actual value of the text, which lies not in providing definitive answers to, where did we come from, or what happens after we die. It instead serves as a guide for how to engage with reality. Although I don't dwell on ultimate origin questions, I acknowledge the ongoing exploration of these topics. Among the more intriguing hypotheses in recent years, is simulation theory, which posits that as humanity perfects simulated reality, the probability increases that our own reality is itself a simulation. Advanced civilizations, the argument goes, would likely generate numerous simulations, making it statistically likely that we inhabit one of them. While speculative and unprovable, this concept offers a compelling lens for considering the function of stories in human development. Stories, much like simulations, create structured frameworks within which we navigate complex realities. Through iterations of narrative, patches, and lessons, humanity evolves culturally and morally, buffering against the raw impulses of biological evolution. The biblical narrative serves as a kind of foundational source code, employing iterative learning through totems, rituals, and stories that instill structure, meaning, and moral alignment. These early literal frameworks, like sacrifices, covenants, and sacred artifacts with their liturgies, instantiated tangible practices that later transitioned into metaphoric expressions, allowing once impossible concepts to take root in human understanding. Seen through this lens, the text transcends tribal and literal interpretations, offering a framework that is timeless and universal. This perspective not only strips away entrenched superstitions and rigid orthodoxy, but also underscores the enduring relevance of the corpus. Whether understood as divine revelation, or as humanity's most profound cultural artifact, its value is evidenced by having been and continuing to be a guide toward a proper alignment with reality. A glimpse at the override. Put in modern terms, the emergence of the ancient story, particularly the biblical corpus given its volume, continuity, wisdom of the group effect, and reliability over time, acts as a software patch to humanity's cognition. Think of it as an override to biology that accelerates cultural development in opposition to the hypothalamus, the base brain regulating the more primal human functions, through the advent of reason, and executive function in the frontal lobe. The creation narrative serves to provide initial lessons that override the original programming. 1,000+ years of physical totem serves as an iterative learning model to impart deep metaphoric answers for how to be, in a given context that fosters human flourishing, in proper alignment with reality, put another way, in abeyance to God. The Holy Spirit is offered as a validation of the idea of God as objective reality, as it personifies objective truth, and is the proper observance of objective reality. The figure of Christ as the final confirmation, the Word, the articulated truth, completes the iterative learning of physical totem, through a storied literal crucifixion and resurrection, that both renders the totems obsolete in favor of the metaphoric, and transitions from the Jewish prototype, to the mass production at scale of both Jew and Gentile alike. The biblical narrative progresses through three key functions, implemented in overlapping phases. 1. The initial software patch of a creation myth, and totemic law. 2. Iterative learning through that totemic law, temple ritual, and prophetic refinement, and 3. The final patch, Christ, which completes the code and transitions from literal totem to metaphoric truth. These functions are in a required sequence for the reasons that follow. The reasons that follow. In order to properly answer, what is this, from a primordial human position, there is a sequence that must be initiated. Early man must attend to the mundane issues of mastering survival, tending to social organization and tribal governance, and knowledge transmission at a minimum before ever turning their gaze to the mysteries of the night sky, in the "what is this" sense. But this is a futile proposition without a framework that aligns with the necessary sequence of human development. I say this as a man who frequented tiny outposts and villages in the western Anbar Desert in Iraq. I was also raised in a rural area where there was less light pollution than in the city, so I was accustomed to seeing more of the night sky than my suburban peers. But Anbar rendered each of these separate experiences as similarly unremarkable in a way I have never seen before or since, save for a handful of freezing nights in the mountains of Afghanistan. The night sky in southwest Anbar put me on my back in awe. Me, a modern man with an iPhone and a suppressed rifle, who actually knew what was up there, yet I was still deeply captivated by it. You can't fully attend to the lower order of Maslow's hierarchy with such a distraction, without saying, "What is that?" 4 hours per night, having no prerequisite knowledge for how to properly engage the question. You must have a placeholder. A creation narrative solves for the physical mystery long enough to engage in the sequence required, to explore and uncover the realities beyond the night sky. In other words, how to be is a prerequisite before properly addressing, what is this? A creation myth solves this problem in the relative term, required to implement the sequence, but the biblical creation narrative has much more value at deeper levels than simply as a placeholder for what is this. Like the whited sepulchre used by ancient travelers, whose purpose we now understand in the context of germs and viruses, the creation story's surface utility becomes obsolete as knowledge advances. Yet beneath this layer lies profound value. Much of this value comes in opposition to the biology that brought us to the point of self-awareness. And self-awareness itself is captured, in the story of the garden, the serpent, and the tree. This narrative initiates what might be considered the first iteration of a software patch, a set of instructions to override the biological wiring of the hypothalamus. Lesson 1: Adam and Eve, Overvaluing the Negative. The story of Adam and Eve begins with humanity's deep-rooted tendency to overweight the negative, a survival mechanism embedded in our biology for good reason. In the wilderness, this instinct served our ancestors well, heightening awareness of threats in an unforgiving environment. But in the garden, a paradise where every need was met, this wiring became a liability. They had everything they could want, save for one thing they could not have, the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That unattainable object loomed large, its absence magnified precisely because it was out of reach. Enter the serpent, a figure embodying the adversary to reality itself. The serpent's whispers are not unlike the bitter Marxist in the corner, insisting that reality is not only flawed, but rigged against you. It echoes Rousseau's claim that man is born free, but everywhere in chains, and Marx's quip that time was invented by a clockmaker to sell more clocks. The serpent's argument is timeless, the idea that what you see isn't real, or worse, that it's a con designed to oppress you. This dynamic lays bare the first lesson of the creation narrative, the human tendency to misplace focus on what is absent, at the expense of gratitude for what is present. It also introduces the adversarial voice, a perennial force tempting us to view reality as inherently unjust and to reject its constraints rather than align with its truth. This moment marks the awakening of human self-awareness, the birth of a mind capable of grasping good and evil, yet burdened by the weight of its own knowledge. And with it, the profound fall into the complex, often agonizing, reality of being. Lesson 2, Cain and Abel. Immediately following the first lesson in the text, is the story of Cain and Abel, a concentrated masterpiece, only 15 verses long. Cain's sacrifice, the fruits of his labor as a tiller of the soil, was rejected, while Abel's blood offering was rewarded. This distinction lies at the heart of the story's enduring power. Abel's sacrifice represents being fully invested, offering something of true cost and significance, a gesture properly aligned with reality. Cain's offering, by contrast, falls short. It reflects a withholding, an act that lacks the spirit of true sacrifice, and fails to meet the standard that reality silently demands. Cain's response to this rejection is the archetypal cautionary tale. Rather than reflecting inward, he directs his rage outward, toward Abel, who embodies the ideal, and whose sacrifice demonstrates the path to reward. Instead of learning from his brother's example, Cain succumbs to bitterness and envy, killing the ideal and thereby severing his chance at redemption. This tragedy repeats at every scale, from the personal to the societal. When the ideal is destroyed out of resentment, everyone suffers. It is a rebellion not just against a person, but against reality itself, a refusal to confront one's own inadequacy and make the necessary corrections. The lesson here is timeless: when sacrifice is unrewarded, it is not proof that the game is rigged, it is proof that the game demands more. To reject this, and destroy the ideal in rage, is to doom oneself, and others, to a lesser existence. Cain's story, brief as it is, speaks directly to the human struggle with failure, envy, and the transformative power of sacrifice. It challenges us to reject the path of bitterness, and instead pursue alignment with the truth, no matter the cost. The human tendency toward entrenched orthodoxy. When I say entrenched orthodoxy, there is precedent for this criticism in the story itself, as humanity's characteristics play out, for better or worse, in the Jewish narrative leading up to the story of Christ. What the Israelite story represents is the prototype of humanity's struggle to align with higher-order truth, while contending with the recurring pitfalls of human nature, pride, corruption, short-sightedness, and ultimately, the institutionalization of belief. This last phenomenon acts as a will to empire that stood against Socrates, the Apostle Paul, Galileo, and Martin Luther, and is as pertinent now regarding churches, universities, Congress, and institutions like the National Institute of Health as ever, as a worthy aside. This encompasses a process by which the early trajectory of the story from Adam through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and Solomon creates the model of prototypical civilization. Certainly, there were others. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolian civilizations. But they are fragmented and do not provide the continuity that can be found in the Judeo-Christian epic. And what flows through the Israelite story is a system that builds onto itself, to first provide a placeholder for what is this and the immediate how-to-be that is compounded on, through literal ritualistic artifacts of totemic law. The Ark of the Covenant, for example, represents the hearts of those being atoned, heart being the ancient Jewish sense that combines one's mind, the core of their being, their orientation in relation to God, and put in modern terms, the model of reality between your ears. There must be a continual opportunity for repentance from error and redemption toward the ideal, as it is the model that leaves the most human potential in play, for cultivation and realization. If you're out of the game forever, you're not as useful as if you could buy back in, with proper realignment. And that is echoed in the story of both the flood and Passover, as it wasn't the wood of the ark that saved Noah and his house, but the red-stained pitch that sealed it from the water, a picture of the blood on the doorpost and the Ark of the Covenant that repeats a signal to be built upon later with metaphor, in opposition to the entrenched Pharisaic orthodoxy that had been established, and corrupted, in universal human fashion. A modern critique of divine judgment. This progression of metaphor and meaning brings us to a perennial critique of the biblical narrative, particularly as it relates to the juxtaposition of the Old Testament to the New Testament. The image of a loving God commanding what, to modern sensibilities, appears as violent atrocity at scale, commonly repels the modern critic. Those who view morality solely through the lens of a modern product of the cultural evolution herein demonstrated, as if it existed a priori, fail to grasp the long road between the abstraction of divine justice and the harsh realities of tribal survival in the ancient world. It is here, in this point of friction, that it becomes important to explore the broader trajectory and completion of the story that provided them the perch from which they view this narrative. The description of Israel as a warring tribe in reference to, say, the Amalekites, is an early point in the trajectory of the longer story, in which Israel iteratively follows God's instructions, inevitably falls away, is confronted, becomes penitent, and renews its dedication to alignment with God. This is in the backdrop of warring tribes that are equated with beasts, that do not align with God, and are not privy to the relationship with Him. A modern criticism of a literal God for commanding the genocide of the Amalekites through Saul, is a misapprehension of abstraction combined with a criticism of the story before it is concluded. To borrow from an earlier story, it is like criticizing Moses for his initial act of killing the Egyptian taskmaster, without acknowledging how his time in exile and his subsequent trials in the wilderness transform him into a leader capable of delivering the Israelites and receiving the law. Similarly, to parallel history, one leveling such a criticism isn't likely to criticize Genghis Khan, or Cyrus of Persia, for their actions within the context of their time, and the level of human development available to them. Their conquests, brutal by today's standards, were not only aligned with the survival imperatives of their era, but also acted as mechanisms for societal integration, cultural exchange, and eventual progress. To impose a modern moral framework retroactively, misunderstands both the narrative and the human trajectory it reflects. What the Amalekite episode demonstrates is the idea of vengeance as required for survival, with mercy on the opposing guardrail. This is a needle in need of proper threading, to this day, though the final framework of the story places vengeance in the hands of God alone. For, reality has a way of playing out properly for the habitually corrupt, while the pitfalls of revenge threaten the potential of those who seek retribution, at the price of wasted purpose. This step in the evolution allows for the notion of impartial justice to emerge. Unique curation, a barrier to further entry. The broader trajectory addresses such previous critiques, while underscoring the biblical narrative's unparalleled sophistication. Its refinement over millennia culminates in a coherent and unified story, standing apart from traditions that fragment or extend beyond their intended bounds. After concluding the canon with Revelation, the New Testament tradition set in place the notion of a completed story with no further narrative to come. The result in this model are derivative stories, like Western fairy tales, moral stories, and mythos, so as not to add to the end of the book as sects of the Old Testament Jewish rabbis did with Midrash, Halakha and Haggadah in Judaism, a criticism Christ leveled against them, among other charges of corruption. Additionally, the single author, single point in time, add-ons of the Quran and Book of Mormon don't work in this fashion for similar reasons. Not to say that there aren't useful derivative frameworks in each of these texts, but they lack the unification that the biblical corpus demonstrates. The time-tested wisdom of the group, found in 40-plus authors across 1,500 years of refined story, is what it is, by virtue of these criteria. The West has largely properly sealed off the canon from addition in a way one might lock a final document and experiment in a new sandbox based on the findings of that locked document. Derivative Western stories such as Sleeping Beauty, in which the prince uses the sword of truth to slay the dragon, and Arthurian legend, where pulling the sword from the stone symbolizes divine election in the hero's journey, are undeniably shaped by biblical themes. Indeed, Western storytelling is so deeply imbued with the biblical narrative that its influence is nearly inextricable. Professor Paul Cantor, a distinguished Shakespeare scholar at the University of Virginia, has illustrated this in his analysis of Hamlet. He contrasts Homer's Achilles, untroubled by the moral implications of vengeance, with Shakespeare's Hamlet, whose hesitation to take life reflects the deep influence of Western values, rooted in the moral complexity of the biblical tradition. This profound and pervasive influence underscores the biblical narrative's enduring role as the foundational framework for Western storytelling, illustrating its capacity to shape moral and philosophical paradigms across millennia. Thought experiment, engine of renewal. There is a thought experiment that I like to use to demonstrate the value of the biblical narrative in cultural evolution. First, a disclaimer. I am making no claim surrounding the scenario of this thought experiment. It is my fiction, borrowed from multiple existing fictions used to make a point, and it goes like this. Imagine that humanity has experienced an advanced civilization, far beyond our current understanding, where answers to both what is this, and how to be, were far more developed. As humanity faces a catastrophic event that will ultimately return the species to sticks and stones, a Hari Seldon-like figure retrieves a text designed to accelerate humanity's recovery. This text operates on multiple levels. First, it provides a placeholder for impossible questions, allowing focus on immediate survival. Then, it introduces moral frameworks that extend humanity's time horizon. Over millennia, iterative rituals and totemic learning evolve into metaphoric truths, culminating in the textual figure of the ideal man, whose life and sacrifice embody the pursuit of truth above all values. His final act, a resurrection, sets the metaphorical framework for individuals to transcend their inadequacies and align with the ideal. And this final act proves that, while the man who articulates the truth can be killed, the articulated truth will rise again. And again. This iterative process not only shapes individuals, but enhances their capacity to contribute meaningfully to society, advancing it as a whole, creating a feedback loop of flourishing and renewal. This properly demonstrates the value of the biblical narrative. And regardless of its origins, and whether or not this was its intended purpose, this was its effect. The story of Christ fulfills the law, or codex, or code, by transcending its totemic elements, stripping away the literal, in favor of a universal metaphoric model. His death and resurrection mark the shift from tribal prototypes to scalable human principles, applicable across cultures and epochs, thus validating the prototype toward universal mass distribution, the final patch. In communion with God through the frontal lobe. Michelangelo's creation of Adam has long been celebrated for its artistic depth, but its anatomical implications are equally profound. In 1990, a Journal of the American Medical Association piece, by Dr. Frank Meshberger, revealed that the image of God, as depicted in the painting, closely resembles the human brain. This observation suggests that Michelangelo, renowned for his knowledge of anatomy, may have intentionally tied the divine to human cognition. The placement of God reaching toward Adam's hand is more than a symbolic gesture of life or divine communion, as he is reaching for Adam through the frontal lobe, the seat of human reason, self-awareness, and moral decision-making. Within the biblical narrative, this relationship between the mind and reality, what might be considered God's domain, takes on profound meaning. The frontal lobe is what allows humans to engage with reality at a level beyond instinct, to weigh future consequences, to transcend immediate desires, and to offer proper sacrifice. If Michelangelo intended this connection, or at least a portion thereof, it explores the idea that our ability to align with reality, God as conceptualized in the text, depends on the unique faculties of human consciousness. Blessed are the peacemakers, Father and Son. The two questions we continually strive toward, boiled down to their highest level of analysis, are, what is this, and how to be? History reflects the undeniable fact that how to be is the prerequisite before we can ever properly attend to what is this. These are the two questions that drive science and religion, respectively. These two enterprises have been in a tribal war for centuries. This battle between science and religion is a battle between a corrupted father and his son, as scientific inquiry was born out of the religious monastery, pursuit of truth as the highest value being a necessary prerequisite for the son to emerge. The pursuit of peace between this father and son, through reconciliation and reformation, will be further explored in the next installment. Thanks for listening. Brooks Crenshaw is a writer, columnist, and speaker who focuses primarily on philosophy, economics, and history, particularly the importance of story. With a background as a naval special warfare intelligence professional and an economic advisor and director of research for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, he holds an MBA from Vanderbilt University. We hope you have enjoyed this audio version of the Daedalus Thread Substack publication. If you'd like to support our work and stay updated on future articles, please subscribe to the Daedalus Thread at brookscrenshaw.substack.com. And follow on Twitter X, @CrenshawActual for more insights and discussions. Thank you for listening.
This has been a Daedalus Thread production. All rights reserved.